Space Shuttle Columbia is called off. Hello again. It's been a day of great disappointment for America's space scientists who'd hoped to send the shuttle Columbia into orbit nearly 5 hours ago. Instead, the Columbia and her two-man crew are still on the ground. Countdown was stopped with just 31 seconds to go, and there won't be another attempt for 2 days at least. The plan to launch the world's first second-hand spacecraft turned into a repeat performance of Columbia's maiden mission last April. Then the first attempt at blastoff was postponed at the last minute because of technical problems. 2 days later, she took off successfully. At crack of dawn today, it was all smiles from astronauts Joe Engle and Richard Truly as they walked to the shuttle after the traditional spaceman's breakfast of steak and eggs. Then there was no hint of the problems to come, and the two men tried on their space helmets for safety checks before going on board Columbia. Launch Control reported that the countdown to blastoff was going perfectly. Bad weather had been a big worry, but although daylight began with lots of clouds, the message was that the mission was definitely on. There was a slight problem that held back the expected takeoff time by about 15 minutes, but the fault was cleared up and everything was looking good for blastoff.
T-minus 50 seconds and counting.
The astronauts were strapped into their seats and the controllers and their computers on the ground were making final checks when the official commentator, Hugh Harris, broke the news that something had gone badly wrong.
T-minus 35 seconds. We're just a few seconds away from switching control to the computer sequencer in the orbiter. T-minus 31 seconds, and we have held at the T-minus 31 second point.
The launch had been stopped by one of the computers, which wasn't happy with just one of the many vital elements on board the shuttle, and the computer refused to set the clock going again. After 2 hours, the bosses at NASA, America's space organization, said the countdown would start again. But just as that was due to happen, came the announcement that the flight had been called off for at least 48 hours. And just over an hour ago, astronauts Engle and Truly came out of the cockpit, and they must have been very disappointed men after hours of tension and excitement. And instead of circling the world tonight, they'll be going back to the special accommodation they have at Launch Control and be hoping for better things next time. But just what did go wrong with only seconds to go? Well, I hope to get the answer now from our space editor, Reg Turnill, who is on the phone from Launch Control. Hello, Reg. What happened?
Well, at least 3 different things went wrong, John, and the last straw was that the APUs, they're the starter motors that fire the main rocket engines, got too hot. I'm afraid it was a bad day altogether for Launch Control here at the Cape. They tried to bend their usually very strict launch rules. The computers twice said no and firmly stopped the countdown. Well, stopping at T-minus 31 seconds, when you've got tremendous pressures in the rockets all ready to burst into flame, is quite hazardous. And I guess there were 2 very anxious astronauts on top at that moment.
Well, Reg, when do you reckon that the shuttle will take off?
We're expecting that the delay in the takeoff will be more than 2 days.
But you can't say when?
No, they've just had a long press conference here at the moment and they're being very cagey about it. They're not quite sure how much work there is to do.
Reg, thank you very much indeed. A sad day at Launch Control. Well, now the
last-minute hitch delays the American Space Shuttle. They'll try again on Friday. The Queen on her way to open Parliament as armed police mingle with the crowds. Helicopters beat the pickets outside a strike-bound Manchester factory. And after all the fuss, England's cricketers prepare to set off for their tour of India. The historic second journey of America's Space Shuttle has been postponed for at least 48 hours, beaten by the clock. At 1:45 this afternoon at Cape Canaveral, the Columbia craft was just 31 seconds from blastoff when the launch computers stopped the countdown. The reason? Problems with the pressure in the fuel tank. So, like the first space shuttle 6 months ago, the 2 astronauts must wait for at least 2 days. From the Kennedy Space Center, our correspondent Martin Bell.
Early morning at the Cape, the Columbia seemed to be towards the end of one of the smoothest of countdowns. The astronauts Joe Engle and Dick Truly were going through the familiar pre-flight routines. the breakfast of steak and eggs and briefing papers. Afterwards, the walk to the suiting room, the final checks of equipment and procedures. The countdown had been so trouble-free, there was little doubt they'd be on their way into orbit, weather permitting.
At the present time, the astronaut crew on its way up the slope to the pad surface, the elevators being brought into position to receive them, where they will go up to the White Room at the 195-foot level.
At that time, it seemed the only doubt was about the weather, cloudy skies and crosswinds, difficult conditions for a return to the landing site in case of an emergency. John Young, commander of the previous mission, went up in the training aircraft to look for a hole in the clouds, and his report was favorable. They could go for launch.
We are go. PLT is go. LRD is go.
The final countdown was on. The so-called beanie cap was withdrawn from the top of the external tank. Columbia was within less than a minute of liftoff.
T-minus 40 seconds. The development flight instrument recorders are on. T-minus 35 seconds. We're just a few seconds away from switching control to the computer sequencer in the orbiter. T-minus 31 seconds. And we have held at the T-minus 31 second point.
The problem identified by the control room was high pressure of lubricating oil in the auxiliary power units, and the Columbia's computers wouldn't take instructions to ignore it.
Launch Director George Page has determined that we will scrub the launch for today.
The postponement was a disappointment for the crowds of guests invited to the Kennedy Space Center. Actor Robert Redford was just one of them. But the greatest disappointment of all, of course, was for the two astronauts themselves. 5 hours cooped up in the spacecraft, and they never got off the ground. The shortest possible delay before launch now is 48 hours, and it could be longer than that. In the end, the Columbia, as a second-hand spacecraft, behaved the same as the Columbia when she was new. Just didn't want to go first time. Martin Bell, BBC, Cape Canaveral.
The Queen's speech opening the
news at 5:45 with Leonard Parkin.
The Columbia launch is abandoned seconds to blastoff. The Queen's speech promises new union laws and curbs on high-spending councils. Helicopters snatch vital equipment from a Manchester factory to beat a mass picket. Good evening. The Columbia Space Shuttle, which today should have become the world's first ever spaceship to be used again for a journey into space, will not now be launched until Friday lunchtime at the earliest. The countdown was stopped just 31 seconds before the shuttle was due to take off because of a technical problem. Then another problem was discovered, and the launch controllers decided to put off the flight for 2 days. That's the shortest time it takes to empty and to refuel the spacecraft.
T-minus 31 seconds, and we have held at the T-minus 31 second point.
A half a minute to go, the countdown froze, but not for the reason everybody expected. The bad weather, thick clouds, storms on the way. The trouble was, Mission Control didn't really know why it had stopped. The countdown clock controls the whole countdown sequence. A computer had stopped it. Had the computer registered a fault, or was the computer itself faulty? The answer came 3 hours later.
Despite some efforts to avoid it, we got nailed by one of the cryogenic tanks being at a slightly lower pressure than we would have liked at 31 seconds.
Which basically means that one of the cooling tanks didn't reach the pressure necessary to cool the system. They also had trouble with their backup power units. All in all, enough to abort the mission and bring the astronauts out of the shuttle. But even that didn't go without a hitch. The closeout team, as they're called, couldn't open the door to let the astronauts out. Several tools failed. In the end, they all tugged together. And the door finally slid open. The crew, when they emerged, did not look suitably dejected. They've each waited 15 years to make this flight. Now they must wait 2 more days, at least. And when the counting restarts, it'll be at launch minus 19 minutes and 45 seconds. John Suchet, ITN.
That report was by Christopher Wayne. He was unable to read it himself for technical reasons. It's all systems stop tonight at Cape Canaveral in Florida. £6,000 million worth of sophisticated machinery, otherwise known as the Space Shuttle, stand idle on the launch pad, victim of what became literally a last-minute hold-up. The Columbia craft was just 31 seconds from the start of its historic journey when the launch computers stopped the countdown clock. The problem, oil pressure in the fuel tank was too high. Now all the fuel, 500,000 gallons of it, is being drained, and that takes time. So it'll be Friday afternoon at the earliest before they can try again. Today, though, they were so confident, as our correspondent Martin Bell reports.
Early morning at the Cape. Just didn't want to go first time. Martin Bell, BBC, Cape Canaveral.
And just to rub salt into the wounds at Cape Canaveral, the Russians have succeeded today where the Americans failed. This morning they launched an unmanned satellite to Venus, and the launch went without a hitch.
Technical doubts. Together they were enough to stop the countdown with just 31 seconds to go. So it may not lift off for a whole week to give the engineers a chance to clear up oil contamination in the hydraulic system. The flight director said, "This hasn't been my day." John Suchet reports from the Cape.
Until the last few hours, countdown preparations had gone so well that some procedures had actually been slowed down. And when the crew ate breakfast, it seemed all that could stand in the way of a launch was the weather, storms coming in from the Atlantic. The breakfast was the traditional one of steak and eggs. After that comes space food, thermostabilized, rehydratable, freeze-dried. The crew moved from breakfast into the suiting up room, the procedure so familiar from early space flights. The astronauts, though, are a bit different. Neither of these two could be called young at 49 and 43, and both wear glasses. Note that Dick Truly's glasses are attached to his helmet. Then out for the short ride to the launch pad, and no doubt a small offering to the rain god. Meanwhile, John Young, who commanded the first shuttle, went up to take a close look at the weather. He flew the same route the shuttle would have to fly if it aborted and returned to the launch site. He needed 50% visibility, he got it and gave the go-ahead for the launch. The final piece of gantry was drawn back and the countdown continued on target with only minor hiccups until there were just 35 seconds to go.
T-minus 35 seconds. We're just a few seconds away from switching control to the computer sequencer in the orbiter. T-minus 31 seconds, and we have held at the T-minus 31 second point.
Everybody assumed it was the weather. By now there were heavy clouds and rain, but it was not the weather, and at this stage that was about all launch control knew, other than the fact that a computer had detected a fault and automatically stopped the countdown. The decision was taken to abort and bring the crew out, but even that didn't go smoothly. The technicians couldn't open the door to let the crew out. Several tools failed, and in the end they all had to tug together. The crew, when they emerged, did not look suitably dejected. They've each waited 15 years to make this flight. Now they'll have to wait 2 more days, at least. And then the countdown will resume at launch minus 19 minutes and 45 seconds.
Always assuming that this goes away. The forecast, though, is for more rain and heavier storms. John Suchet, News at 10, at the Kennedy Space Center in Florida.
There were 2 problems: fuel cells that didn't work correctly and so stopped the computer in the countdown, and trouble in an auxiliary power unit. Peter Sissons in the ITN Space Studio asked Dave Scott, a former Apollo astronaut, which problem was the more important.
Well, I believe the latter problem, the problem with the auxiliary power unit oil pressure, was the most serious of the 2, but neither one were really serious.
What did that affect?
Well, that affects the hydraulic system on board the vehicle, which powers the control surfaces, and the auxiliary power unit is a pump which drives this hydraulic fluid. The pump is lubricated with oil, and it appears that there was some contamination in the oil which resulted in a higher pressure than normal, an abnormal pressure with which they were not comfortable. And that's because they just haven't had the experience with it yet, and it just didn't feel right.
And what about the other problem?
Well, the other problem occurred earlier, and that has to do with the fuel cells which provide electricity for the vehicle. As you know, the fuel cells utilize liquid hydrogen and liquid oxygen combined to make water and electricity. And in the liquid oxygen, the temperature of that particular vessel was too low. And when they got to 31 seconds, the computer in the automatic mode said, "That temperature is too low. I've been programmed to stop if the temperature is low. It was not a serious problem, but it was below some limit that had been defined before the flight. So,
what would have happened if the launch had proceeded with those two problems?
probably nothing. Here again, we're in a test flight. We do not have a lot of experience with little problems like that, and we try to fly conservatively. And in all probability, the flight would have been all right, but why push it in a test flight when you may have some other problems as well?
Poland today appears... And at least for the launch, all three of the power units on board must be working. Yesterday, two of them were clearly in danger of failing. The lubricating oil wasn't circulating properly, so at worst, they could have seized up. And if they'd failed during blastoff, then the shuttle would have been out of control. It could have gone anywhere. Well, thankfully that didn't happen. But while there's any such risk, there's no chance that NASA would try for another launch. Well, they won't know how serious the problem is for another 2 or 3 days. But NASA's estimate of a week to blast off might yet prove to be a bit optimistic.
At Cape Canaveral in Florida, new snags have been threatening the launch of the Space Shuttle. It's due to blast off tomorrow afternoon at 12:30, having failed last week by just 31 seconds. Then the problem was in the fuel tank. Today, that's been a problem too, but they're confident there'll be no delay this time. And that'll be a relief to the American government. The 8 days delay has cost up to £1 million more in overtime, fuel costs and travel expenses. Reporting now from the Kennedy Space Center, our correspondent Martin Bell.
Was among the least of the problems worrying launch control. There were others potentially more serious, including this morning a drop in the pressure of the hydrogen system in the huge external tank. That was traced to a faulty valve and corrected. There was also a failure of an instrument that relays information from the spacecraft to launch control. A replacement unit was flown in, and for most of the day, Space Agency workers have been installing and testing it. There is at least a chance that this could cause a one-day postponement, and the NASA people would prefer to avoid a launch on Friday the 13th. So the pre-launch news conference, usually a rather upbeat affair, was clouded with uncertainty.
I'm trying to get a readout in another 2 or 3 hours as to whether we've got the thing under control or not. But we'll let you know during the day here as to what our status is. And there is no reason to believe that we won't get this tidied up before we pick up the count tonight at 10 o'clock.
Do the crew have any preference against going on Friday the 13th?
I haven't discussed that with them, so I can't honestly say. I would doubt that they do.
The crew, Joe Engle and Dick Truly, are already here, and they at least are confident of going.
We really are going to go this time. I think there wasn't anybody any more surprised than Richard and I when we heard that we had to call the scrub last time, because we were thoroughly convinced that we were just about ready to lift off. And we just got that feeling we're going to really do it this time. You can get the weather good for us again.
We've just got to stop meeting out here like this. I'm going to say it one more time. The Columbia's ready, and Joe and I are ready, and we're going to do it this time. Thanks a lot for coming out here.
The routines are unvarying, only the problems change. The astronauts were out early practicing takeoffs and landings in a training aircraft got up to imitate the cockpit conditions of the Columbia. Joe Engle and Dick Truly, disappointed once, are perhaps more hopeful than anyone else of a launch on time tomorrow. But a further delay is still possible, and the astronauts won't really know that they're going until the count gets past the 31-second mark. Martin Bell, BBC, Cape Canaveral.
Well, let's hope the shuttle has fewer problems than us. I'm sorry we lost the sound at the beginning of that report too. But if it does happen on time, BBC One will be covering the launch in a special edition of News Afternoon, starting tomorrow at 20 past.
The American Space Shuttle Columbia, due to try for its second launch tomorrow, has had 2 more technical snags, although engineers are confident they can put them right in time. NASA officials say everything should be ready for Columbia's blast-off around 12:30 tomorrow. John Suchet reports from Cape Canaveral.
Columbia rode a plume of white-hot flame into cloudy skies. That's what the Detroit News told its readers last week, but this is what Launch Control told the world.
We have held at the T-minus 31-second point.
The voice belongs to Hugh Harris, NASA's countdown man, and tomorrow he hopes to say once again, we have liftoff. The sheer frustration of last week is not something he wants to repeat.
Well, it's always a tremendous emotional drain. You know, all of a sudden you feel very tired. Everybody is geared up to go. There's a certain level of energy and excitement and, being very sharp, and watching every single thing. And once that happens, then, all of a sudden you're turned off and you feel let down.
And this time?
Well, we feel very optimistic, and we're ready to go, certainly, and we're getting all excited again.
This time the shuttle has had a proper million-mile service. The oil has been changed, but 1,001 things could still go wrong, and 2 already have. A pulse code modulator which records and distributes information is not working, and there's a drop in pressure in the fuel tank. NASA scientists told us today they're working flat out on the problems, and they will solve them. Certainly the astronauts aren't worried.
Thanks a lot for coming out. We really are going to go this time. I think there wasn't anybody any more surprised than Richard and I when we heard that we had to call the scrub last time, because we were thoroughly convinced that we were just about ready to lift off. And we just got that feeling we're going to really do it this time. You can get the weather good for us again.
We've just got to stop meeting out here like this. I'm going to say it one more time. The Columbia's ready, and Joe and I are ready, and we're going to do it this time. Thanks a lot for coming out here.
And if they do, Richard truly will be sitting on the biggest birthday candle of his life. He's 44 tomorrow.
There is one other thing we heard at Launch Control. If the shuttle doesn't go tomorrow, it'll go the day after, Friday the 13th. John Suchet, News at 10 at the Kennedy Space Center in Florida.
And ITN will be on the air at 18 minutes past 12 tomorrow with a special programme bringing you live coverage of the launch from Cape Canaveral.
Hours later than planned, the astronauts and the scientists at the Kennedy Space Center are now confident nothing will stop the countdown this time. The latest setback came overnight when a fault was discovered in an electrical transmission device. That's now been put right. The weather's perfect, the astronauts, Truly and Engel, say they're relaxed and ready to go, and the shuttle is fully fueled on the launch pad. From the Kennedy Space Center, our correspondent Martin Bell.
A hard day's night out here on pad 39A, and the first good news 40 minutes after midnight was that the countdown was on again. The 2.5-hour delay had been caused by the difficulty in finding a working replacement for the communications unit that failed. The unit, called a multiplexer-demultiplexer, was flown in from California last night. It was cannibalized from the Columbia's sister ship, the Challenger, being fitted out at Palmdale. There's been gloom enough at the Kennedy Space Center these past 24 hours, but it was brightened at last with a note of optimism from Bill Anderson, the Rockwell pilot who brought the spare parts in.
We got 2 of them. One of them's going to work.
Have they been tested yet?
Oh, yeah, they've been tested. They've been in use at Palmdale.
The replacement unit then passed, as the astronauts themselves will very soon now, through the clean room on the Columbia's access arm into the spacecraft itself. It was tested and found to be working. So early this morning, technicians out on the pad could go ahead with the fueling of the huge external tank. Does that mean an end to the delays and malfunctions that have plagued the second liftoff? We just don't know, as the astronauts themselves won't know for sure until the moment of launch. But a further delay would severely embarrass the financially strapped and politically troubled space agency. Martin Bell, BBC, Cape Canaveral.
So things looking fairly good for a 3 o'clock launch. With me now is our space consultant, Geoffrey Pardo. Geoffrey, I dislike asking these questions, but are you confident that there'll be a 3 o'clock takeoff?
Yes, with what we know, I'm now pretty confident. I think the main elements have been put right and the thing is set fair. There might be some small delays, but yes, I'm confident.
Has the number of bugs in this project been unusually high?
Not really. It is, after all, the second development flight of an extremely complex thing. There's 7 million parts in this whole thing. So they expect to find it. I mean, it's found in a glare of publicity and it takes a little while to put it right. No, it's not particularly unusual.
How critical was this data processor to the actual flight itself?
Strangely, it wasn't critical at all. This simply collects the millions of bits of information, the data, and brings it together in a form that can be understood, recognized. It monitors the flight. In fact, there's 16 of the units that went wrong. Just one happened to have a failure. It monitors it. Without it, the flight couldn't go properly, but it certainly wouldn't affect the actual functioning.
Jeffrey Pardo, thanks very much. Well, we'll be on the air again at...
Last week, liftoff for Columbia's second journey into space was called off because of contaminated oil. This time, a fault was found in a small box which transmits information to Earth about temperatures and pressure. New equipment was obtained from Columbia's sister ship, Challenger, now being built at Los Angeles. This from John Suchet at the Kennedy Space Center.
Dawn at the Cape, the countdown back on, yesterday's gremlins successfully killed off. But not without a mercy dash across the country. From the west coast late last night came a cardboard box about 2 feet by 2 feet, weighing 15 pounds and containing a multiplexer demultiplexer, without which the shuttle cannot fly. Actually, they brought 2, just to be on the safe side. The shuttlecraft has 2 of these machines. One failed yesterday, and the replacement for it failed too. These latest 2 came straight out of the factory in Los Angeles. This time they were taking no chances. The boxes carried a baggage label that must be the most understated of all time. It took an hour to unpack the piece, then an almost casual engineer at the entrance to the shuttle itself handed the part in. This small box, which gathers in information from all over the ship, converts it to digital and feeds it to the computer. A small problem, it was a bit dusty, but they cleaned it up. So far then, so good. But no one here is putting his head on the line and saying the shuttle will go this time, for sure, on time. John Suchet, News at 1 at the Kennedy Space Center in Florida.
Peter Sissons will be presenting ITN's special program on the launch at 2:45 this afternoon. He's made 2 missions into space on Gemini 11 and Apollo 12, which was hit by lightning just after its launch to the moon.
Dick, bad news for the shuttle program if they can't get it off today.
Well, they've already had their gremlin, and I think that's a good omen. When we have problems early in the count, we seem historically to run through and be smooth. So I'm counting on that omen to get us airborne today.
Presumably this vital part, the multiplex... Now, is shuttle proving perhaps too complicated a machine for the routine tasks which lie ahead of it?
Well, I think we must remember, Peter, that it is indeed in a test program at this time. And it is not necessarily a proven vehicle yet. It has several test flights to go through, and once it becomes operational, we think that these problems will be solved. We're learning more about it each time we fly it, and that's the road to success.
But test flying is about taking some chances, isn't it? Why are they so reluctant to commit it without it being 150% right?
Peter, it's the only one we've got right now, and we just can't afford to take the chance to have something happen to that vehicle in flight. There are only going to be 4 of them built, and if we lost one, that's a 25% reduction in your force, and we just cannot afford to take that unnecessary risk at this time.
Will this be getting the crew uptight?
I don't think so. We're used to this kind of an environment, and I think the crew is just simply anxious to fly, and they're prepared for these kinds of events.
We'll see you later, Dick. Back at 1:45. Hello, good afternoon. America's space bird Columbia, reluctant for more than a month now to leave the nest a second time, is poised at last for another try. 8 days ago it came within 31 seconds of liftoff. Today there was another 2.5 hours delay. They say now she'll go in just under 15 minutes time, at 3 o'clock our time. But I should imagine you'll believe it when you see it. But when it does happen, you'll be watching history in the making. Never before has a spaceship flown a second mission, the first step towards space travel becoming routine. Watching this second test flight with us, the experienced eye of astronaut Dick Gordon, veteran of 2 missions, Gemini 11, in which he walked in space, and Apollo 12, the second moon landing, in which his job was to pilot the command module which circled the moon while Pete Conrad and Al Bean went down to the surface. Dick, do you expect Columbia to go today?
Peter, I sure do. It looks like they've already had their problem. It should go. They're in the final verification before they pick up the count at 9 minutes. which should be very shortly.
Dick, thank you. Well, our man at Cape Canaveral is John Suchet. What do the prospects look like, John, from where you're standing?
Good morning, Peter, from the Cape, and good news right away. It's a gloriously warm and sunny Florida day. A little bit of cloud, but nothing like the overcast skies of a week ago. As long as it flies, you'll get a much better view of the launch today than you would have done a week ago. A little bit of wind, which is not a problem for the launch. What worries them is that if they have to abort soon after the launch, they'll have to bring the shuttle back to the airstrip here, and in that case, wind could be a problem. But at the moment, it's all clear for a launch. It was a hectic night here last night. Yesterday, one of the shuttle's instruments, which glories in the name of multiplexer, demultiplexer, failed. Its backup failed too, so they stripped one out of Columbia's sister ship Challenger and flew it from the west coast right across the country to here. It was installed overnight, it works, and it's beginning to look as if Richard Truly will celebrate his 44th birthday with a trip into space, but nobody here is guaranteeing it. Back to you.
Well, you heard John Suchet there mention that problem that was rectified overnight. We can now see the new part arriving at the Cape and being loaded into Columbia. There we are. Dick, what are they bringing? What is it?
Well, you heard John say it was a multiplexer, demultiplexer. Nothing more than a black avionics box that they have to use to signal conditioning for instrument displays, computer talkbacks, and the like. It's essential for flight.
It couldn't have gone without it?
No, it wouldn't have gone without it.
And if it had gone without it last time, would it had to abort?
When we're in flight, we can do a lot of things that we can work around some of these kinds of problems. There is another box just like the one they put in that would take in its place.
Now, you heard John Suchet mention it was Dick Truly's 44th birthday. So it's a pre-launch breakfast with a difference this morning at the Cape. Normally they get up, they're woken early, they have their steak and eggs, and then it's off for suiting up and then to the launch pad. But this is what happened this morning at Cape Canaveral. There's Dick Truly on the left there, next to Joe Engel, his partner in today's flight, and the colleagues there at the astronaut HQ, giving them a good send-off. Have you known a scene like that before, Dick?
I've never been to a birthday party before launch.
And you can see the cake. I think that's the cake there, a sort of chocolate-looking construction in the shape, roughly, of a space shuttle. And I don't think too much of its aerodynamics. Now, we can remind Dick of something in his past, briefly, and tell you a bit more about him. He has the distinction of being on board a blast-off from Cape Canaveral in 1969, which probably came nearer to having to abort just after liftoff than any other, because he was hit on board Apollo 12 by lightning 40 seconds after liftoff. Dick, this was it.
It was kind of an interesting morning, Peter, and the fact that there was a great deal of overcast, a lot of rain, the visibility was very poor. We really didn't think they were going to launch, but we were ready, and they did. Shortly after we got airborne, 36 to 40 seconds, there was a big, loud roar at the Cape.
Let's hear the sound.
Just disappearing now.
And then Pete Conrad reported.
Well, he reported that everything lit up like a Christmas tree when the electrical system went out. We really weren't quite sure what happened. Pete saw a blue flash, and we were quite sure then it was lightning.
Now, we're coming up to the most critical part of the countdown, today's countdown, that is, the 9-minute mark at which the launch director must decide whether all his pre-launch checks allow him to go ahead. So, will it be 9 minutes and holding, or 9 minutes and counting? John Suchet is at the Cape listening with us.
Yes, Peter, we're approaching the end of the 9-minute hold. This is the hold in which the final checks are made, and at the end of it, if all is well, the go for launch is given. And after this hold, assuming that all is well, an automatic launching system begins. And of course, it was at this stage last week that things started going badly wrong. So I'll let you hear now, Space Control, Launch Control announce the end of the 9-minute hold. Well, we're still waiting for the end of that hold. It has not come.
This is Shuttle Launch Control, T-minus 9 minutes and holding. Launch Director George Page asked for a slight delay in picking up the countdown at this point. Well, he checked a couple of things which he heard during the countdown. He has just checked with the range safety officer to determine that a dropout of the main carrier wave that is used by the range safety people is not serious, and that a backup carrier signal is satisfactory. He is also checking on several other things, and we will get back to you as soon as a determination has been made to pick up the countdown. This is Shuttle Launch Control.
Well, Peter, you heard that. There has been an extension of the hold indefinitely, but we're told that the problem is not too serious. But for the moment, there is an extension of the hold.
Dick Gordon, how serious do you think that sounds?
Peter, it sounds like we've been here before, but it sounds to me like it's nothing more than a communications problem. The range safety officer does have a backup system, but I'm sure George Page wants to make sure everything is in his favor before he commits to picking up at 9 minutes.
Who is this range safety officer?
He's the officer there that's watching the trajectory of the booster and the shuttle during its launch phase in case it deviates from predicted trajectories, so they can alert the crew of a possibility of an abort situation occurring. He has a responsibility to make sure that that booster is clear of the beach.
So there's no problem being picked up inside the orbiter?
No, it's a communications problem in his own particular network, nothing to do with the spacecraft.
So at least that sounds okay.
Well, I'm hopeful that we'll pick that up pretty quick.
Well, let's move on now. Let's just talk about what's different for a moment about this second test flight while we've got a few moments in hand. It's longer for a start, 83 orbits instead of 36. The first flight in April was 36. It's orbiting lower because it's slightly heavier, and it's heavier because of a number of experiments that are being carried. It's got its first payload, scientific payload on board. Perhaps the most dramatic piece of new equipment being carried by Columbia is $100 million worth of bionic arm. And here it is. And in fact, bionic is quite an apt description of this 50-foot cherry picker. It has a rotating shoulder socket, an elbow that moves in only one direction, and a wrist that has two joints and moves both ways. It was built as Canada's contribution to the shuttle technology. Now, its main task will be to lift satellites from the payload bay and position them in space, and to retrieve satellites in need of repair. Its camera could also inspect the shuttle itself for damage to the tiles of the heat shield, as happened on that first test flight. Dick Truly, you can see him there practicing, is the crewman assigned to working it. Some 13 hours will be spent putting it through its paces, which is impossible, you'll appreciate, on Earth, because its delicate mechanism is designed to operate in zero gravity. It weighs less than 1,000 pounds, but its makers say in space it can pick up objects that weigh 65 times that. I'd have thought that in space, this cherry picker, Dick, could pick up anything if nothing has any weight.
Well, Peter, it probably could if it were mechanized to do so, but remember that Newton's laws still have an effect, and there's a momentum problem. You have to start it moving, and once it's moving, you also have to stop it. So it has to have some structural rigidity and does have limitations.
Is it a hazard to the crew?
It's a possibility that it could be a hazard. I wouldn't like to think that it was, but it does have to be stowed before re-entry. Now, they have prepared for an EVA in case extravehicular activity to go outside and look at it and possibly get it back in. If that fails, they can jettison this arm so that cargo bays can close.
Of course, it would be a very serious matter if it jammed the doors in some way.
It certainly would. Those doors have to be closed for re-entry.
Although the Canadians, I shouldn't imagine, would be all that pleased if they just kicked it adrift and it became another piece of space junk.
Well, they wouldn't like to see that, but they would have to build another one for us.
Right, well, now we're going to get an update on that hold. It's 9 minutes and holding rather than 9 minutes and counting at the Cape. We've got a small delay, but not inside the vehicle itself. Let's go over to John Suchet at the Kennedy Space Center.
Well, we're told that there are one or two little snags here, none of them serious, but the launch director, George Page, has spoken direct to the crew, and he said this to them: we're going to give you a good one. In other words, they're not going to let anything stand in the way of a perfect launch, and they would rather hold it up a few minutes than have anything go wrong. So at the moment, one or two little problems causing a small delay, but again, not expected to cause much of a delay.
John Suchet at Cape Canaveral. John, thank you. Let's now carry on with the theme of what's new about this second test flight. I mentioned earlier it was taking a palette of scientific experiments. The man to tell us about that is ITN's space and science consultant, Dr. Gary Hunt. Gary, what are they up to?
Well, we have 7 experiments on the mission, 5 of which are actually on the spacecraft itself, and they're really a chance to start looking at the surface of the Earth and indeed the oceans for the first time from the shuttle orbit.
I think we've got some pictures of the sort of thing they might
So we
be...
try to simulate the sort of things that can be done using existing satellite observations. And in fact, when we use Landsat as an example, we can see the rocks and rock structures to scales of just a few tens of meters. And this is an opportunity to look at different type of rock types. So we're looking at the resources that the Earth actually has. There's a second instrument, in fact, to look at the larger structures, the actual fragments of the rocks, and even look through the ocean, look at the ocean floor, which again gives an idea of the importance of mineral structures that we can study. But also the ocean.
Well, we seem to have a... now we've got your picture.
Okay, so now we're looking here at Landsat pictures of, in fact, of Devon, and you can see here the actual structures, and the forced colouring bring out the different rock types that actually are present. So if we do this to the entire globe, we can use this as a means to classify the different structures. Here we can see, using even higher resolution of 20 meters, the actual structures in the rocks and indeed the pipeline that goes out at the bottom of the ocean. So we're looking through the ocean here, and this is an opportunity then to study whole areas around. And these are looking at the structures in the ocean itself for heat transport, again relative to climate. So these major experiments are our first opportunity to try new experiments on Space Lab. There are 2 others looking at pollution of the atmosphere, and there are 2 more actually on the area where the astronauts are themselves. They're taking photographs of lightning, and also they're studying...
I must stop you, Gary. We have a
just ordered that the clock will be picked up at 1 minute after 10 Eastern Standard Time this morning. We have just had a check of the various major managers for this morning's launch. Norm Carlson has conducted that check, and all of the managers have said they are ready to pick up at the proper time. The launch director, George Page, has just asked Deke Slayton, the OFT launch manager, if he is go, and Deke Slayton has said he is go for launch. We're about 2 minutes away from picking up the countdown at the T-minus 9-minute point, which would result in a launch at 10:10 a.m. this morning. This is Shuttle Launch Control.
Well, Dick Gordon, that means that they hope to go now, but 10 minutes late.
Peter, they'll start a few minutes after the hour to start that 9-minute countdown when it goes on the automatic sequencer, and I still expect it to go.
Now, this 9-minute period, why 9 minutes?
It's where the automatic sequencer starts all of its functions to automatically check the booster, the spacecraft, and everything associated with launch, and it takes that 9-minute period right down to engine ignition.
Now, what we're going to do now, I think I've just got a moment, actually, to remind you of how the shuttle gets up and down and what makes it different from other space vehicles. Now, you correct me if I'm wrong, Dick, but we've come a long way since people like you were put on in a tin can on top of a rocket and blasted up, and nothing could be used again, and even the tin can, when it came down, was useless to anybody.
We do bring some of it back this time, don't we?
Yeah, we bring back the solid fuel booster rockets here. These are reusable. These are the pack horses that get it into orbit. The rocket's own motors, which are on the bottom here, are fueled by fueling this huge tank here. That's the only throwaway part.
That's the external tank is scheduled to be jettisoned in the Indian Ocean. That's right.
Yeah, and that's $6 million worth, but they throw it away. But anyway, the rest is reusable. That's what makes it totally different. And of course, the whole thing, when it's finished its mission, comes back on its wings. We go over to the
All
Cape.
of the major managers have indicated they are ready to go, and we are at T-minus 9 minutes and counting. The launch sequence are now being controlled by the ground launch sequencer from now up to the T-minus 31 second point, when they'll switch to the onboard redundant set launch sequencer. The ground launch sequencer is part of the launch processing system and operates by relaying commands to the orbiter's onboard computers, which then reports back to the launch processing system that the commands have been executed. The primary job of the computers is to check that all of the launch commit criteria are being met, such as propellant loads, temperatures, pressures, and other measurements. The chase aircraft have been launched from Patrick Air Force Base to take part in the activities of this morning's launch. T-minus 8 minutes, 10 seconds, and counting.
Dick Gordon, a quick translation.
They're going. They're going to count down, and they're going to get this thing off the ground this time, Peter. I knew when they had the problems last night that we could expect something good to happen.
How far, given the enormous pressures from the administration on the cost of this thing, which is running so late, would it be a political decision to go today?
No, I don't believe so. I don't think anybody would acquiesce to that kind of thing. There's too much on the line for this thing to fly and fly properly and get all the test objectives completed that this flight is intended to perform.
What has held it up before, of course, is computers. Computers have spotted some last-minute defect. Do you think the computers are too sophisticated on this machine?
No, they're not too sophisticated. We need them. But one problem with computers, Peter, is that they cannot make decisions.
They can't make
judgments. They can make no judgments. They make decisions.
5 seconds away from retraction of the crew access arm. T-minus 7 minutes, and there goes retraction of the crew access arm. This is the walkway attached to the service structure and used by the crew to walk across to the orbiter. The crew has been advised to lower their helmet visors, and at T-minus 6 minutes, we'll begin preparations for starting of the auxiliary power units. The APUs are turbine devices fueled by decomposing hydrazine liquid, which provides hydraulic power to change the angle of the engines, to operate the aerodynamic surfaces, engine valves, and during landing, operate the landing gear. Coming up on the T-minus 6 minute point in our countdown. That's it, Mark. T-minus 6 minutes and counting. The pilot, Dick Truly, has begun the APU pre-start activities. APU pre-start is complete. And it is complete. The development flight instrumentation, which measures stresses on the orbiter during flight, have been turned on. Recorders stop for playback after landing. T-minus 5 minutes, 40 seconds, and counting. T-minus 5 minutes, 30 seconds. And pilot Dick Truly has signified the auxiliary power units are ready to be started. T-minus 5 minutes, 15 seconds, and counting. We're coming up on the T-minus 5 minute point. 2, 1, T-minus 5 minutes. We have a go for APU start, and the start sequence has begun. T-minus 4 minutes, 44 seconds, and counting. Yes, sir, that can work. Minus 4:30. T-minus 4 minutes, 30 seconds, and counting. We have a total of 16 minutes of hydrazine supply for running the APUs prior to a liftoff. Okay, APU start is complete. Looks good on board. APU start is complete. T-minus 4 minutes, 10 seconds, and counting. T-minus 4 minutes. We have begun nitrogen purge of the main engines on the orbiter. T-minus 3 minutes, 50 seconds, and counting. T-minus 3 minutes, 45 seconds. The elevon, speed brake, and rudder are being moved through a pre-programmed pattern to assure that they'll be ready to be used in flight. Little exhaust from the APUs coming out the tail of the orbiter, indicating that all is well. T-minus 3 minutes, 28 seconds, and counting. The shuttle is now on internal power. However, the fuel cells are still receiving their fuel from the ground support system through the tail service mast for 1 more minute. T-minus 3 minutes, 15 seconds. The profile checks of the aero surfaces have been completed and checked. T-minus 3 minutes, 5 seconds. The engine gimbal or movement check is underway to assure that they're ready for flight control. T-minus 2 minutes, 55 seconds and counting. The LOX valve on the external tank has been closed and pressurization begun. After the tank is pressurized, the hold capability is limited. T-minus 2 minutes, 40 seconds. We have cleared the caution and warning memory. The gaseous oxygen vent arm is being retracted. T-minus 2 minutes, 30 seconds and counting. The fuel cell ground supply of oxygen and hydrogen has been terminated, and the vehicle is on its onboard supply. T-minus 2 minutes, 15 seconds. The main engines have been gimbaled to their start position, and the pressure on the liquid oxygen tank is at flight pressure. Coming up on the 2-minute point. T-minus 2 minutes and counting. The liquid hydrogen vent valve has been closed and flight pressurization underway. T-minus 1 minute, 50 seconds and counting. Copy. The gaseous oxygen vent arm is almost fully retracted. T-minus 1 minute, 40 seconds and counting. T-minus 1 minute, 30 seconds, 90 seconds away from launch of STS-2. T-minus 1 minute, 15 seconds and counting. The liquid hydrogen tank is at flight pressure. Coming up on the 1 minute point in our countdown, everything going smoothly. T-minus 1 minute and counting. T-minus 50 seconds. The firing system for the ground suppression water is armed. T-minus 40 seconds. Development flight instrument recorders are on. T-minus 37 seconds. We're about just a few seconds away from switching control of launch to the computer sequences. We have control of the countdown now being conducted by the launch sequencers on board the orbiter. T-minus 20 seconds and counting. The SRB hydraulic power units have started. The SRB nozzles have been moved to start position. Coming up on 10, T-minus 10, 9. We have go for main engine start. We have main engine start. Minus 3, 2, 1. We have ignition. We have ignition of the solid rocket boosters and liftoff of America's Space Shuttle, and the Space Shuttle has cleared the tower. Houston now controlling. Mission control confirms roll maneuver started. 20 seconds. Thrust looks good. 25 seconds. Roll maneuver completed. 30 seconds. Columbia now 1 nautical mile in altitude. 35 seconds. Status check mission controlled by Flight Director Neil Hutchinson. Going to go at 40 seconds. Columbia, Houston, you're go at 40. Roger, go at 40. And master arm, left at 48 seconds. Throttling engine down for Max. Roger, ignore the master alarm, Columbia. Okay, no. Coming up on trade of maximum aerodynamic pressure on the vehicle. Mark 1 minute. Columbia now 5 nautical miles in altitude, 3 nautical miles downrange. Velocity now reading 2,300 feet per second. 1 minute, 8 seconds. Pass through max Q. Columbia still looking good. Throttling engines back to 100%. Mark 1 minute, 20 seconds. Columbia now 9 nautical miles in altitude, 6 nautical miles downrange. Velocity now reading 3,000 feet per second.
Mark, 1 minute 35 seconds. Columbia now 14 nautical miles in altitude, 10 nautical miles downrange.
Columbia, Houston, you can expect an evap, C&W.
1 minute 45 seconds, coming up on negative seats where altitude's too high for ejection seat.
Your negative seats.
Roger, negative seats.
What we're waiting for
Mark,
next
1 minute 55 seconds, Columbia now 21 nautical miles in altitude, 18
is the separation of the solid rocket boosters. So far this has been one earth-shaking event here.
Solid rocket booster separation confirmation.
Roger, copy. EC less than 50.
And there they go.
Confirm good solid rocket booster separation.
Smooth as glass, Houston.
2 minutes 25 seconds. Onboard guidance is converging as programmed. Columbia is now steering for its precise window in space for main engine cutoff. Columbia now 35 nautical miles in altitude, 40 nautical miles downrange.
Hey, Houston, the temps are coming down and looking good. Roger, Columbia, thank you.
Mark, 2 minutes 45 seconds. Columbia now has 2-engine landing capability at Rota Naval Air Station, Spain. 2 minutes 54 seconds. Status check and mission control given a go for 3 minutes.
Columbia, Houston, you're looking good at 3. Roger, copy, looking good at 3.
One of the chase planes we're seeing now.
Mark, 3 minutes 8 seconds. Columbia now 46 nautical miles in altitude, 66 nautical miles downrange. Columbia's 3 main engines continue to run smoothly. England truly really moving out now. Velocity now reading 6,700 feet per second. Mark, 3 minutes 30 seconds. Columbia now 52 nautical miles in altitude, 85 nautical miles downrange. Velocity now reading 7,000 feet per second. Return status check and the mission control by Flight Director Neil Hutchinson. England truly given a go to continue. Mark, 3 minutes 55 seconds. Columbia now 58 nautical miles in altitude, 112 nautical miles downrange. Velocity now reading 7,900 feet per second. 4 minutes 8 seconds. Standing by for a negative return and pressed ATO call-ups by Capcom Brandenstein.
Time for negative return. Mark, negative return.
Roger that. Sounds good. With that call-up, England truly now committed to space travel. They can no longer turn around and return to launch site. 4 minutes 35 seconds. Columbia now 60.
Columbia, Houston, you're pressed to ATO.
Pressed ATO. Looking good here. 4 minutes 44 seconds. For the first time, Columbia has forward abort to orbit capability on 2 engines by throttling engines up to 107%.
This is Martin Bell at Cape Canaveral. That means that all is going well, all is entirely on course. The astronauts are on their way into orbit and just about out of sight of us now, and we'll be prepared then to hand you back to the studio in London.
Seconds. Columbia now 68 nautical miles in altitude, 228 nautical miles downrange.
Half a ton of fuel a second being burnt there, Dix.
That's an awful lot of it. And you can still see that. Isn't that a great sight? Of course, you can't see much, but
Mark,
the
5 minutes
exhaust
40
plume.
seconds. Standing by for press to MECO.
Press to MECO means that they can get into orbit, or to main engine cutoff.
Columbia, Houston, you're pressed to MECO.
Roger, press to MECO.
That means everything looks good.
This is really smooth. 5 minutes 55 seconds. The press to MECO call from Capcom Brandenstein says, should Columbia lose but 1 engine, press on, keep flying forward. Columbia's engines have enough energy to achieve normal attitude.
Single engine rota and everything's looking good.
Okay, Dan, single engine rota and looking good here.
That means they could get to rota just on 1 engine now.
Mark,
so
6 minutes 18 seconds. That report from Capcom Brandenstein indicates if a 2-engine failure occurred, Columbia is capable of an emergency landing at Rota Naval Air Station, Spain. Mark 6 minutes 30 seconds. Columbia now 68 nautical miles in altitude, 346 nautical miles downrange. Velocity now reading 14,900 feet per second.
And a couple of minutes now from main engine cutoff.
Mark 6 minutes 50 seconds. Columbia now 67 nautical miles in altitude, 397 nautical miles downrange. Columbia pitching over now, diving to increase velocity, decrease altitude, giving Columbia her most favorable attitude. 7 minutes 5 seconds. Standing by now for single engine press to MECO.
Which means that they could actually get to orbit on one engine at 107%.
They actually control the engine.
Yes.
That's new, isn't it?
7 minutes 20 seconds. That report says that England truly can achieve normal engine cutoff targets even if two engines go out.
If two went out, they had one remaining, they could still get into orbit.
Seconds. Columbia now 64 nautical miles in altitude, 511 nautical miles downrange. Velocity now reading 20,000 feet per second.
Not a luxury you had,
7 minutes 43 seconds.
No, that's true.
G-forces building for England truly now, coming up to 3 Gs. Columbia now 63 nautical miles in altitude, 562 nautical miles downrange.
What's 3 Gs feel like?
It's not bad with the position you're in on that couch. You're pressed back to your back.
8 minutes.
Columbia, Houston, you're go at 8.
Go at 8. Another half a minute.
Columbia's main engine's slowly being throttled back now. Should be throttled at 65% at 6 seconds before main engine cutoff. Columbia now 63 nautical miles in altitude, 645 nautical miles downrange. Velocity now reading 24,000 feet per second.
Only 1,000 more feet to go.
We don't have a picture of
8 minutes,
the
28 seconds,
exhaust plume at this stage.
Main engine cutoff.
That's probably all you would see, but
Okay, Houston, we got a good MECO.
there it is. Engine shut off on time.
Roger, we copy, Columbia.
Confirmed shutdown. Columbia now returned to space, not yet returned to orbit. Standing by now for external tank separation.
Columbia, Houston, you can ignore the IMU bites.
That was a glitch on our inertial measuring unit. They can ignore it.
8 minutes, 58 seconds. Confirm external tank separation. Columbia now performing an evasive maneuver, moving below and beyond the external tank.
They just use their RCS system, their
9
reaction
minutes,
control
15
system.
seconds.
That's a small engine.
Just a small engine, just to move away from the tank.
Control for the first dome's burn.
You don't want to hit it again.
No.
Roger, Columbia, we're looking at them.
And now those small engines give it the final pushes to orbit.
Yes, they're orbital maneuvering system
Columbia,
engines.
Houston, your go for nominal ohms 1 and for APU shutdown on time.